apenas as instruções sobre a interpretação. Nós temos logo abaixo, na parte inferior direita da sua tela, tem o ícone de interpretação, onde você pode escolher a interpretação em português. E assim você terá a oportunidade de ouvir toda a apresentação de hoje nesse idioma. Muito obrigado.
All right, now that we're all connected in all of our various languages, I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's session, or today's session, or this morning's session, depending on where you're joining from. On behalf of the Tribal Link Foundation and the UNDP Equator Initiative, we welcome you to the second in a two-part special installment of Indigenous Voices, entitled COVID-19 and Indigenous Peoples, Updates from the Frontlines. Before we introduce our guests, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that many of us are joining this circle from the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, which is the ancestral name for what we now call North America. Moreover, we acknowledge the Lenape and all other American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands that I now call where I sit, New York City. Over the years, Tribal Link has had the good fortune to cultivate strong bonds with leaders from indigenous communities the world over. In this session, we're joined by three of them, and I'm excited to have you hear their perspective and learn about what's going on the ground in their communities at this vital time in the world. We're joined by Janene Yazzie of the Dine and Navajo peoples in the US, Jupta Itoewaki of the Wayana people of Suriname, and Karl Briscoe of the Kuku Yulanji people of Australia. My name is Michael Ventura, and I will be your moderator for today, this morning, whatever it may be. Tonight's session is meant to help us gain greater understanding and empathy for the impact COVID-19 has had on these communities and their ecosystems. And so I'd like to begin with Jupta. I'll give a brief introduction to her and her work, and then we'll go into an interview style format. Just so you know, we'll be spending about 20 minutes with each participant, and then we're going to bring all three of them back at the end to do live Q&A with the crowd. So if you have questions, please feel free to hold on to them till the end. You can drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand through the Zoom functions, and we'll be able to call on you to ask questions at that time. Jupta Itoewaki is a Surinamese indigenous rights activist, development worker, politician, and mother of her son, Moshel. She is the current chairperson of the Mulukat Foundation and has been working as an independent interpreter and translator of the Wayana language since 2010. Since 2013, Jupta has been acting as the spokesperson of the chief of the Wayana. In addition, she has worked for the Surinamese office. That was fun. She's worked for the Surinamese office of the Amazon Conservation Team, took part in training as a field health assistant of the medical mission, a facilitator for her village in the South Suriname Conservation Corridor Program of Conservation International Suriname. Since 2017, she's been working on projects for the Association of Village Leaders in Suriname. Recently, Jupta also served as a research field assistant and interpreter for the research on hepatitis alongside the Maroni River in collaboration between the Surinamese and the French government. Jupta, welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
So I'd like to begin by just getting a bit of a snapshot from you as to what's happening on the ground now. We've been, as a global community, living in this pandemic for about a year now. And I think it would be really helpful to understand the front lines from your community, how COVID is impacting your world at a local level.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction, Michael. As you know, the impact of the COVID-19 has also, the impact has been very huge on our community. Mostly for us as Mulukat, most of the activities or the projects that we are doing, we are on hold because we are not able to fly into the villages. Because we talked to the, there are just some things that we talked with the communities that we're not going to fly into the communities just to make sure that people do not get infected because we don't know who has it. Another thing is that because of the activities that we're on hold, one of the priorities that we have are the food security or the food sovereignty project that we are doing in our community, which has led to that there was not enough food in the community. So these are some of the huge impact because a hungry community is not what we want. And on top of that, the climate change had also made things worse in our community, because the farmers, but also the hunters, especially the farmers, had a very hard time getting their farms ready because of the drought and the extreme hard rain that was happening in the communities.
Thank you. And so as COVID has come into this community and you've seen it start to have its impact, in the span of the past year, how is sort of the infection rates now relative to where it was maybe 6 months or a year ago? Are they on the rise? Are they declining? Are they kind of staying in the middle? Just give us a sense of sort of where the pulse is at the moment.
So we have been actually very fast in acting when we heard that the first case was in Suriname, in the capital. We didn't wait for the government to act and give information or awareness to the communities, or to especially the indigenous communities, because experience has told us that when waiting for the government, it's usually too late. So when the first case was actually in the capital, we, as Mulakot Foundation, already acted on the information that we had gathered globally from indigenous communities and indigenous organizations, but also WHO. And we translated and interpreted these messages for them, this information and this awareness. And another thing is that we really acted fast. So there was, I think March, the first case was in Suriname, and then for a couple of months there was no case at all. And then I think it almost in the end of last year, there were some cases. But thankfully, because the traditional medicine that we also use, there were not severe cases. So right now, we actually don't have any cases right now, because we just acted very fast on this.
That's great to hear. And maybe just to go one level deeper on some of the traditional medicines, this morning in our previous session, we heard from quite a few of the participants how the indigenous medicine and the sort of traditions around taking care of the mind, the body, and the spirit from their ancestral traditions have actually been a big support system for ensuring that their immune systems are strong and that their resilience is strong in the wake of this. And so could you maybe share a little bit about what that entails, or what some of the traditional practices have been?
Yeah, so because of what was happening and the lockdown that was being ruled in Suriname, one of the things is that even some of the medication couldn't be flow into the communities. So we had to the polyclinics in the villages, they didn't have enough medicine. So we had to go back to our traditional medicine, and thankfully to the elders, some of the young people took initiative and say, what are the medicine that we can use to make our immune system stronger? And one of our traditional medicine that we have been using is actually called wataki, and it's a drink. It's like some kind of tea made from a tree bark, which is very bitter, but really good for boosting your immune system. And it actually would work really good, because some of the people in the capital and outside of Suriname heard about this medicine, and they even used it. And some of them were even in the IC, and they, within a couple of days, they were got out of the AC and got better. So it really worked. And like I said, there were not severe cases in our community because of the traditional medicine that we had used, or that we are still using.
That's great to hear. I love that. So can you tell us another area that I'm interested in unpacking a bit is how education is working in the community right now, and how awareness for COVID, how people are getting, whether it's information around protective equipment, or the way the disease is being transmitted, or things like that. What's working in your community to ensure that people are aware of the science, aware of the ways to protect themselves, so on and so forth?
So as I already mentioned, we acted very fast, and couple of things that we did as the Mulokad Foundation was translation of the information that we had. We as because I know my community is not a community that really loves reading, but we have a history of oral storytelling. So that is what we use to give them the information, but also make them aware of what was COVID. Because in the beginning they were like, nah, it's only a disease that only hits, for example, white people, and the strong people in the jungle don't get this kind of disease. So what we did was we made short animation to movies in their native language to raise awareness. Another thing is that we used our medium, the Wayana podcast. That's a podcast that we use on a regular basis to share information. So last year, the podcast was only used almost for only sharing information and making people aware of COVID-19, but also updating them what was happening in other indigenous communities such as Brazil.
I don't want to.
Another thing is that together with NGOs such as the medical team in Suriname,
Turn the microphone on.
You are.
we translated posters for them, but basically more with like animation drawings. Another thing is that with the help of PAHO and UNICEF in Suriname, we made videos about washing hands in the native language, but also information films for them in our native language. What we did is also that we blocked our airstrip and our river so that outsiders couldn't come to our community, so we can isolate ourselves to not get infected people into our community. What we also did is that we created COVID aid package for the villages, which included sanitary supplies such as masks, soap, hand sanitizer, but also food packages for the communities. As I mentioned earlier, that because of this pandemic, it led to not enough food in the community. So we also provided food for the communities.
Amazing. What a great, and as you said, quick amount of big work in order to protect the community. So congratulations and well done. One other thing that I've been interested in, because it's been true in a lot of communities, both indigenous communities and non-indigenous communities, and I wonder if it's the case for you. You had mentioned that the landing strip was shut down and you were creating that isolation in order to protect everyone. Was perhaps an unintended consequence of doing that, that multi-generational aspects of the community have gotten closer together, that actually, you know, because of that isolation, actually the community has somehow gotten stronger in some ways. Has that been the case on the ground for you?
Yes, partly. I think what made us mostly stronger is that not just barricading the airstrip and the rivers, but also just the questions that we kept asking ourselves: how are we going to protect ourselves from not getting the disease, and if we do get the disease, how are we going to deal with this? And one of the things is that since my community is with the border with French Guyana, but also not very far from Brazil, what we do is that we visit cross borders and things like that. And these were some of the things that we really talked about and made just told each other with leaders, with the help of leaders, but also young people, especially to protect the elders that are in our community, to not to cross borders anymore, and just to stay safe, and like I said, go back to the traditional medicine. So that's one huge thing. And another thing is that because of how to think of ways of to survive this pandemic, we were, yeah, you could say partly getting stronger and united. So yeah.
That's great. Yeah. One other question that, I think Tribal Link has always done a good job as an organization for helping to make sure that needs get elevated globally. So if there's a particular issue, if there's a particular topic that a community is struggling with or challenged with or needs support around, the tribal link community has often come together to help that. And I know you know that as being an important member of it for so long, but I'd love to know, is there anything specific you need that this organization and that this group of people listening and this group of people that will watch this video at a later point can know about? Are there needs, are there asks, are there things that would be supportive to you and your community at this time?
Yes, but I would like to thank Tribal Link Foundation because they have been helping us also last year with funding, but also with a lot of information that was needed. So thank you, Tribal Link. On what we need right now is actually there is a lot of talking about the vaccine right now, and a lot of Indigenous people are misinformed and fear taking this vaccine. So as one of the people, as an Indigenous rights activist fighting for better health, access to health, I was glad to hear that that the Indigenous groups or the Indigenous people, the Indigenous communities would be one of the first to get this vaccine. But I've seen that my community, or not just my community, but the Indigenous people in Suriname, we really know we don't want this because they're trying to kill us and all these conspiracy theories. So one of the things that I would really, what would be really helpful is how can we together with other Indigenous leaders, but surely also Indigenous health workers, to make the Indigenous people aware of that this vaccine is actually safe to use, and that is that it is safe to use. So that is one thing right now that is very important, because we don't have a lot of information about the vaccine yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. It's something that came up in this morning's session as well. We had several people joining from Russia, and they talked about this very same thing, where the misinformation and the information are sort of conflicting, and the Indigenous communities need a reliable source in order to understand how to act and how to protect themselves. So it's a great ask, and I think as we learn more across this global community, we'll be able to share best practices and things like that as we go along. Last question for you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, particularly around what this experience has illuminated for you as you've been a part of this pandemic that's happened to all of us in this world for the past year? Are there any lessons? Are there any messages? Are there any things that you feel would be helpful to share with this community that you'd like to pass on?
Yeah, surely. I think that this pandemic really taught the world that some things are just taken for granted. And by that I mean that I hope that this pandemic showed the world and non-Indigenous people how Indigenous people sometimes really feel when their freedom is taken away. And by that, the freedom was taken away. I mean, they could not really do what they wanted. They could not move how they wanted. And I hope this opens some eyes for us as Indigenous people, that other people can support us and join us in the fight for our rights, such as our self-determination, and that they will stop asking why do Indigenous people need special rights and things like that. So I hope now that we could all stand together, now that we have experienced how horrible it is not to have your freedom ripped away somehow from you, and that there will be more understanding in supporting when we fight for our Indigenous rights. And I want to close by saying this to all the Indigenous community, that we can overcome this disease like we have overcome all the diseases and torture and the colonizations we have been through in the past, that we are strong and resilient people, and that our ancestors are with us, and they have made sure that we are still here. What we need to do is just go back and connect with our lands and our spirituality. We need to hold on to our indigeneity. Let us always keep in mind that everything that we do, like a good friend and a mentor of mine once said, what kind of ancestors do I want to be? That we have that in mind always in everything that we do. Ipong Manay.
Thank you, Jupta. What a beautiful closing message. I really appreciate you sharing all of that, and I'm sure others do too. Thank you. We'll have Jupta back shortly for a question and answer session near the end. Appreciate you sharing all of your thoughts and wisdom with us. Next, we're going to invite Karl to join us. Karl Briscoe, by way of background, I'll give you a little introduction to him. He is a proud Kuku Yulanji man from Mossman, Daintree area of far north Queensland, Australia. It is the morning for him. He's in the future for me, as I'm sitting here in New York. Karl is the CEO of the National Association of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Workers and Practitioners. He has worked for over 19 years in the health sector at various levels of government and non-government, including local, state, and national levels, which has enabled him to form a vast strategic network across Australia in order to address the health and well-being disparities that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are faced with. Karl, welcome.
Yep, Yalada. Thank you, Michael. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and their lands where you are coming from online today. I'm coming from Ngunnawal country, which is Canberra, the national capital of Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the many landscapes and the environment that still remains under our continual custodianship. And it's a pleasure to be here today, Michael. Thank you very much, Tribal Link, for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. So Karl, I'd love to start in a similar way to our conversation with Jupta, just to get a bit of a snapshot from you on the front lines. And I know that you have ties to a couple different parts of Australia. So if you want to give us a little bit of a snapshot, I know Australia, broadly speaking, has done a pretty good job in with respect to many other countries about keeping the pandemic on lockdown. But if you could share with us a little bit about what's going on the front lines today, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay, I suppose very much from the outset of COVID-19, you know, we saw this as a direct attack on the human race, especially our Indigenous peoples, who I'll refer to as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. You know, in ensuring that their safety during this pandemic, especially our elders and our elderly, you know, our Indigenous peoples are at higher risk of health conditions compared to the rest of the populations. We're ensuring our traditional knowledge holders are protected in order to pass down that wisdom and expertise. And currently in Australia today, the COVID virus is only being transmitted from returned international travellers. So our government has really locked down hard the borders. And as of last night, we've saw one of the workers in the hotel actually contract the coronavirus. However, I will say, you know, it doesn't affect our Indigenous peoples.
That's great. Sorry, go ahead. I don't know if I cut you off.
Yeah, I suppose, and because of that, you know, we have not seen one death in Australia contributed to COVID-19. So there is a lot of work that went on in the background with our Indigenous leaders, you know, at the forefront, very much like what Jupta was saying around not waiting for government. You know, they took the initial steps to advise government to lock down our communities to protect our elders. So they introduced some biosecurity acts and things like that, which enabled our communities to be safe.
That it's been an example for the world. I think, you know, it was actually just by virtue of sheer happenstance. I was actually in Australia. Was the last flight I took. I was there on March 15th, leaving Australia as the pandemic was really kind of hitting its full tilt as I was returning to New York. And even on that flight, I remember, you know, the captain and the flight crew talking about how if you're planning on coming back, be prepared for a long quarantine because we are doing everything possible to make sure this country is protected. And I just thought it was, you know, very wise of them to get ahead of this issue so quickly. And so for all the work you've done as a part of that in your communities, thank you. One question I'd like to ask as a follow-up is, because I think it has been a best practice in many ways in learning how to handle this and how Australia has handled this pandemic. What were some of the best practices at the Indigenous level, either working with elders, working with youth, that you would really credit for some of the swift and effective action?
Yeah, I suppose, from the outset, we saw our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, stand up and actually, call out government to implement certain things, which, has had a really positive effect on keeping the virus out of our, a lot of our remote Indigenous communities. One of the things the government, did establish was a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander COVID-19 advisory group. So this meant we were able to escalate our issues and concerns up to this advisory group and then onto the highest levels of government in order for action to be taken in a timely manner that protected our Indigenous peoples. So yeah, there's a couple of, it wasn't just one thing, there was a couple of things that kind of lined up very nicely. And I suppose, privileging the voices of our Indigenous leaders has enabled, for our people to be protected during this pandemic.
And how has technology played a role in that connectivity? Because obviously, Australia is a very big place, and getting to and from places with this pandemic has certainly shut down certain borders. So, have there been tools or resources that have played a role in that from a digital or technical standpoint?
Yeah, there have been. I mean, our particular organisation, what I head up, we've conducted webinar sessions, where people can dial into and learn about what's going on nationally. Information is being able to be shared, but also with that, some of their issues and concerns, we were able to get specialised and guest speakers on to actually talk them through, to do a presentation, especially their social and their emotional well-being during this time. It was those feelings that have never been felt before. Your community is locked down. You have the army at the beginning, like at the roads that go into your community, locking it down. So those sense of isolation, to that level have never been felt by a lot of our community members. So, having our Aboriginal psychologists come on and take us through, some of the feelings that we might be feeling and how things that we can do to overcome them. So that was, technology played a key role in supporting our communities. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you talked about how the elders have been sharing a lot of that work through technology, and so I'd love to know how the elders and some of the more ancestral wisdom has played a role, either vis-a-vis storytelling or other ancestral means. How does that play into the pandemic narrative for you and your community, and where has that storyline sort of shown up for you and your community?
Yeah, I suppose last night I was actually talking to one of our elders where I'm from, and she shared, with me about our Indigenous peoples. We're used to sharing and the load in helping out each other's during difficult times. With the pandemic, really bringing communities even closer together. I suppose the willingness to share, what we have, whether that be food, a house, the sharing and caring aspect of our culture, non-Indigenous people themselves, she said, non-Indigenous people, they look after themselves, but we look after our community, our people. and especially in times of need. I suppose one of our key leaders who was at the forefront of this pandemic, her name's Auntie Pat Turner. She leads a national health association in Australia. You know, one of her key messages that she said, you know, they are, especially in terms of our elders, they are our universities. They are the holders of our knowledge, our culture, cultural history, our culture, our history, our customs, and our languages. You know, and that rings so true. That rings so true right across Australia. There was a non-Indigenous professor, which I looked at one of her quotes, you know, and she said, you know, this was supposed to be a disaster, but because they acted, the Indigenous leaders, so responsibly, it was a model of how we can prevent an endemic in high risk populations. This just goes to show when Aboriginal leadership is listened to. You know, that's coming from a non-Indigenous professor. And so I don't think we can underestimate the fact that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders during this pandemic have actually done quite a remarkable piece of work in protecting our communities, our culture, our traditions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And it reminds me to mention that after this session this evening, we're going to be sending around a survey to all of Tribal Link's community where we can start to cultivate and gather some best practices around what has been working, where are there pockets of need, even if it's some other part of the world that isn't geographically accessible to you and your community. Maybe there's still wisdom, knowledge, you know, a technique, a resource that you've used or that someone else has used that we can share, because in this time, I think the world, while it has gotten more isolated in some ways, has also become more connected. And so we, as Tribal Link, want to make sure that we build those bridges and that connective tissue so that the Indigenous communities around the world are working together as one. So thank you for reminding me to mention that. We're nearing the end of this section. I'd like to ask you one final question. And of course, if there's anything else you'd like to share that I haven't asked you, feel free to build on this. But much like my last question with Jupta, I'd love to know if there is a lesson that this experience of the pandemic has taught you or has exposed you to that you want to share with all of us in this community, because this is that opportunity I think we have right now to elevate these points of wisdom that sort of emerge in this work. So I'll turn it to you for any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think really, you know, in Australia, like we obviously have cyclones, which you probably call hurricanes. We had massive bushfires at the beginning of last year. Then we went straight into the pandemic. So natural disasters, epidemics, you know, Australia had done a lot of preparedness, especially we have Aboriginal community controlled health organisations. So they were well ahead of the game before a lot of the government organisations, you know. But I think, you know, the lessons that we've learned and as a nation is privileging the Indigenous voices within Australia in terms of protecting and knowing what is best practice for in protecting our Indigenous peoples. I suppose just in regards to, I'd like what Jupta was saying around the misinformation around COVID, the COVID vaccine, we are actually experiencing that as well. You know, there's people out there, you know, putting these claims and how they're trying to test it on us first, which actually isn't true. So, you know, what other countries are experiencing, you know, in terms of, you know, misinformation being put out there, we also do experience that as well. And that's probably one of our key challenges at the moment, because in the next couple of weeks, there's plans to roll out the vaccine in Australia. So it's trying to dispel those myths that are out there about these vaccines, and in order to protect our people, our Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Karl. It's very important, and I know as we start to move into that next stage of fighting the pandemic, that that ability to share information and facts with communities as quickly and effectively as possible is critical. So thank you for sharing all of this. And as I mentioned earlier, Karl will be back later. So if you have questions for him, hang on to them. We'll be able to gather those from the audience soon. Thank you, Karl.
Okay, Jumanajal, thank you.
And coming up next, we have Janene. I'm going to welcome Janene to the screen here. And while we get her on here, I will give a quick background of her and her work. Janene Yazzie is a Dine people. She's working in the Sustainable Development Program Coordination for the International Indian Treaty Council and the IITC's representative as a co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group of the UN. High-level political forum on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. She's a community organizer and human rights advocate who's worked on development and energy issues with Indigenous communities across the US. She's developed expertise in infrastructure policy. She's integrated land and water management issues. She's done restoration and protection of traditional ecological knowledge systems. She's helped lead and support community-led mutual aid efforts across the Navajo Nation, bringing much-needed services, resources, and supplies to communities and households heavily hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. She's been at the front lines. She's been working with the Dine Center for Research and Evaluation and as a research partner with the Dine College's Dine Policy Institute to investigate the cultural and spiritual impacts of COVID on Navajo communities. Janene, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Very happy to have you and to hear your perspective on all of this. So in keeping with the opening tradition of all of these, I'd like to ask you first a little bit about sort of what's happening at the front lines in your communities, the folks that you're spending your time with the most. How is COVID impacting them, and sort of give us a snapshot of what's happening on the ground?
Well, speaking to the experience of my communities on the Navajo Nation, we have been identified as a hotspot early on during the community spread of COVID-19 in the United States, and have unfortunately maintained that position throughout the course of this pandemic. Our communities were, like Jupta was talking about, already exposed to pre-existing conditions and pre-existing health disparities that made our people particularly vulnerable to the impacts of COVID. And so as a result of that, we tried to organize early. We tried to anticipate some of the needs of our communities so that we could be better positioned and resourced to respond to those needs. But I think that there was nothing that could have really prepared us to deal with the overlapping challenges of climate change, of tribal and federal bureaucracies, and the ways that these prevent the efficient and effective distribution of basic necessities and supplies and access to safe and healthy food and water resources.
It's been really hard to see and watch, and I don't think that the American press covers that issue even remotely close to as much as they should. But from what information we do get in sort of more mainstream channels, it's shown again that sort of the policy in this country has really kind of put any Indigenous peoples and their rights and their access to care at sort of the back of the line. And it's an issue that I know we in this community at Tribal Link and others have been aware of and fighting against for a long time, but it doesn't make it any better. And one thing that I've been thinking about, and I've been really interested to ask you about as we've led up to this event, was we in the US are seeing both a federal and a state level amount of care sort of coming into different communities. And is there a better job being done at one or the other, or maybe a better way of asking that is who's doing it worse to support the community, and where are the bright points, I guess? Where are sort of the gaps where things are getting better, if there are? Where are some of the things that, you know, if given more resources, more support, could actually drive forward better support and care to the communities? Are there any gaps that are actually working right now?
That's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Well, first of all, at the federal level, because I know this has been most publicized and has received the most attention, the Federal CARES Act funding that was distributed to tribes was meant to be an extensive package to help tribes address a lot of the issues and challenges that our communities were facing. The reality of it is that distribution came way too late to really get a hold of and get out in front of the community spread of COVID in our communities. And it came with very confusing interpretations about what did qualify as eligible expenses for the use of these COVID funds, which placed our tribal governments in very difficult situations. For example, having pre-existing water infrastructure issues and water quality issues created a big tension around whether or not we could use COVID funds to build new water infrastructure projects, because technically that was a need that existed prior to COVID and not a result of COVID. And so those types of technicalities made things made big issues for the effective use and quick use of those types of resources. But there were also non-monetary resources that were distributed from the federal government, like to our local hospitals, our Indian health services, such as PPE, ventilators. And in the early distribution, there were huge concerns about the quality, the safety, the effectiveness, and the usability of those types of equipment, with many ventilators being outdated, with unscrupulous contractors being awarded these government contracts to give PPE that was not effective and safe to protect our communities from the spread of COVID. And all of this was compounded at the tribal level, because even though we have tribal sovereignty and the Navajo Nation itself has its own 3-branch governance systems, people not knowing the histories behind how our tribal governments were structured and the limitations that have been placed on the exercise of sovereignty of those tribal governments makes it very hard for people to understand all of the red tape and barriers that come with using federal funds. And so our tribal governments themselves had their hands tied in how to use these resources, so that one of the projects we work on, which was to get safe drinking water to very rural, isolated, vulnerable households, didn't actually get the CARES fund it was awarded until November, and only had a 3-week turnaround to spend and ensure that all of that funding was earmarked and properly accounted for. That's next to nearly impossible when you take into consideration that not only are these administrative and reporting functions very tedious and take a lot of time, but everyone that is doing it is living within all of the challenges of being in the midst of these communities where we are seeing our relatives be taken daily, and we're seeing the losses and the impacts in our communities in real time, and yet are still forced to work through all of the barriers and jump through all of the hoops to be able to use this funding that was given to us in a qualified way.
Thank you. It's so helpful to hear that perspective, because it isn't, as I think not something that reaches a lot of mainstream media. So this is it's important for those of us joining to really get a perspective on that. From an education standpoint and an awareness building standpoint at the local level in these communities, are there what are the distribution channels, or what are the tactics that you're using to raise awareness around how people can be well protected? What are some precautions? What are all of the sort of blocking and tackling needs that we have to have in order to get these communities knowledgeable about prevention?
Even though we're situated within the United States and we have a land base that's about the size of, a little bit bigger than the state of West Virginia, the community infrastructure is severely lacking. So access to electricity, which is a vital part of staying connected in our highly technological world, is one of the major barriers for keeping up consistent communications to vulnerable households, especially when, as part of social distancing precautions, they are advised to stay at home and stay in place. So it's been really amazing to see how all of the different levels of Dine professionals have, from our youth to our medical professionals, have worked very hard to harness both the available technology by spreading information through social media and other online outlets, while also respecting that a large majority of our population still relies on getting their information from radio, AM, FM radio, and using those types of stations to get the information out to people. But even through those channels, it's enormously difficult to reach the households that needed to get this information the most. And so the mutual aid efforts went above and beyond to really develop their own educational materials to hand out with care packages, or to pass out and post up in community spaces, or at watering wells where people who haul water because they have no water or electricity to their homes can access and see that information. And they did it not only using English, but using illustrations in order to make the information more understandable. And in some cases developed Navajo language materials. And one of the early studies that has been conducted showed a strong link between the rate of community spread and the lack of access to information in the Navajo language. We assumed early on that it was going to be lack of access to clean water or overcrowding in housing that would have the higher correlation with community spread. But in fact, it was this one indicator about whether or not people received information in our ancestral language that had the stronger correlation.
Mm-hmm. And as we now head into year 2 of this pandemic, and hopefully under this new administration, some things move more swiftly in the right direction, there's still obviously a need for swift support and resources. And so, as I've mentioned in prior segments today, how can this community be supportive to you? I realize geography may play a role in not being terribly supportive or being able to be on the ground, but there are other ways that people can help. So are there particular things, resources, time, technology, whatever it might be, that you have an ask for, that we can use this content as a way to sort of raise the awareness against?
Well, first, I want to acknowledge the contributions that have already been made by Tribal Link, both in participating in joint fundraising efforts to get some funding out to our communities. We were the recipients of a $1,000 grant that was split evenly between two of our very vital mutual aid efforts, K Info Shop, which was putting together care packages for our unsheltered relatives who were falling through the cracks in every program of COVID relief. And the other half was given to an organization run by a great colleague of ours, Lauren Anthony, called Chij for Che, which translates to wood for grandpa. And they were doing wood hauling because many of our community members still depend on wood for cooking and for heating their homes. And so that type of support to get to on the ground mutual aid efforts is extremely critical, because people who can harness social media and Facebook advocacy very effectively can sometimes accumulate and monopolize resources that come into our communities and not really redistribute it to the people on the ground, getting these resources to the households that need them. And so I shifted my work to do more of that type of support for these smaller community-based mutual aid efforts. And in doing that, realize that right now we really, not only, I want to echo what my colleagues shared here in terms of really needing to continue the education process around vaccines and producing more reliable, informative materials that could be distributed to our communities, both in English and in our native languages. But also we need everyone to focus their energies around the conversations about what does building back our communities look like, and advocate with the communities that have been impacted hardest by this pandemic to lead the development of the solutions that we need. In learning from our elders and our traditional knowledge holders, this pandemic and the imbalance that we see in our environment is part of many, many prophecies from many, many nations. And if we don't take this moment to learn from this pandemic and what it is teaching us about the dangers of habitat loss, about the dangers of man-made climate change and unsustainable development, on the flip side, about how quickly we as society can change our behaviors to initiate more safe and sustainable and efficient ways of working, of educating, and of doing and being, we're going to see this again. And that's kind of what we've been hearing from our traditional knowledge holders, is that we have to take this moment to learn and to work together and collaborate for more rights-based solutions, for solutions that restore our sacred relationship with our environment and with all living things. And in this process, one of the biggest surprises that we've seen is that there's still, even in our tribal government, so much we have to fight for in order to get recognition for our traditional knowledge holders and medicine keepers, and for them to get the proper resources to share their gifts and to do what they do best for the spiritual, cultural, mental, behavioral, and physical healing of our peoples.
Well said. Thank you so much for that. That is a message that I think that reverberates way beyond the borders of Navajo Nation or the U.S. borders. That is a global message that I think so many of us need to hear. So thank you for sharing that. Last question for you, and frankly, what you just described may have been it, but I will ask you anyway. Are there any sort of closing thoughts or big lessons that would extend beyond what you've just described, which I think is pretty much one of the biggest ones you could share? So I don't mean to put you on the spot to trump that per se, but is there anything else I haven't asked? Is there any information you want to share that we haven't already talked about that I want to make sure you get out into this community at this time?
I think it can't be overemphasized that we need healing, we need healing as individuals and as communities after we manage to do the massive vaccination that is necessary to help us, and to come together again and start the planning for how we envision our futures. We can't do that without acknowledging all that has been lost. And for Indigenous peoples, this is particularly important because every individual that has lost is a library, is an organizer, is a land and human rights defender. And we can't have that loss reduced to the numbers. We have to take time to grieve and to heal and to put in the work to honor the lives of those that won't be here after this pandemic is over.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that on so many levels. It's heard and it's appreciated by all of us. Let's bring both Jupta and Karl back onto the screen with Janene. And Janene, thank you again for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. We're going to open this up to Q&A from the audience. So what I'd like to invite everyone to do at this time is, if you have a question, you can use the functions in Zoom to raise your hand, and we can unmute people who have questions. Or if you prefer to drop it into the chat, you're welcome to do so there as well. I turn it to this community to share, and I also invite our panelists, if you wish to have any questions for each other, you're welcome to share them at this time too. I know it sometimes takes a moment to work up the right question or the right thought, so we'll give folks some time to do so. Roberto, I see you unmuted. Go for it, brother.
Yeah, just greetings to my sisters and brothers. I just wanted to say that I really was moved by all the presentations this evening, and I think the contrast was really stark, right, about what's happening in, let's say, Australia as compared to what's happening in Navajo Nation, right? And it seems that, when the people are given the opportunity to really engage and enact and fulfill their responsibilities via self-determination as called for, that it really makes a difference on the ground to our people. And when there's overreach or lack of, from government, we see time and time again that, if our people don't act, our people suffer, right, because of this. And so, I want to commend everything that's happened in the communities in Australia and Suriname, and also, just extend our heartfelt prayers and thoughts and energies and everything we can to Janene's people as well. And I think that, we're online, we're getting this message out, and this is a lesson for everyone. And we talk about, and Janene knows this very well. There's a tagline that's happening in the international community right now that's linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's leave no one behind. And sometimes we see that's it's an interesting tagline, but we see that our people are being left behind. On the other side of that, though, we can also think that maybe we want to be left behind in some of this, with some of this nonsense going on, and we want to have the right to say no to certain things, like when communities want to lock down We see a similar situation would happen in the Great Plains of United States when the indigenous peoples nations there wanted to close roads or put some kind of checkpoints in for people to make sure they were following protocols. The surrounding folks, the now dominant society was up in arms like we were infringing upon their human rights. But people forget that human rights has to work both ways. You can't be talking about rights for one people if other people rights are being violated. That's not human rights, that's privilege. Right? So I just want to really just extend and thank these three great speakers for their presentations, and just a special virtual and spiritual hug to our sister Janene, who's been going through so much, and she's a real warrior. I'm very proud and honored to know her, and all of us, and everyone at Tribal Link too that put this program together. So with that, I say, hahom, ituno kena atiaono. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you, Roberto. And thanks directly to you too. Roberto behind the scenes has made so much of what we're having today possible through his work, through his commitment to this topic and this community. And so thank you, brother. We appreciate you. There's a question in the chat that I know, Jupta, you touched on this a little bit, particularly with one traditional medicine, but there's a question about what, if any, traditional medicines from the Amazon are currently being explored in the treatment of COVID in the communities. I know you had mentioned the bark of a particular tree. If you could maybe repeat that one, just so people, if they missed it, if they joined late, know that, and if there's anything else that's being explored in that side of the traditional medicine world.
Yes. So the tree bark that we use, it's called in the Wayana language wataki. We also have another indigenous community in the south of Suriname, the Tarino, and they use Wayama. It's also a tree bark, bark of a tree. And it is similar to the wataki, but it's also bitter, but I don't know what else they use in it. So unfortunately, I only know the native names for these medicines, but don't know the Latin name. So but I promise that I will find it and then share it with Roberto, and then he can share it with everyone. There have been a lot of useful traditional medicines, not only used by indigenous communities in Suriname, but also by the tribal people, the Maroons, African descendants that are here in Suriname. And it has been proven effective, especially in boosting the immune system. So, and I don't know the names of these things, but one of them was, for example, I think it used to be effective against malaria, and the same medicine, I think it's called quasibita. It's also so they are all bitter drinks, teas that they are using, but they are really great for boosting your immune system, but also to get all these bad things out of your skin. So it's been very effective. So I don't know if other indigenous communities have been using similar things, but I hear that they were also using, but I really don't know what these names are, but we have to ask and see what the names are. Yeah.
Thank you, Jupta. Janene, I saw you shaking your head too. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, this has been one of the reasons we've been advocating so hard for access to things like PPE, but also resources for our medicine men and our medicine keepers. Because in the early days of community spread in our communities, hospitals were becoming filled to capacity and having to turn people away, having to discharge people who were still suffering from COVID symptoms. And so people were going and seeking our elders and our traditional knowledge holders for prayers, for ceremonies, and for relief. And I was nodding my head because all of our traditional medicines are very bitter as well. And they're all, as our people were learning more and more about this disease and working with people to understand not only how COVID was impacting them, but underlying conditions. They were putting together different mixtures of that they knew of to help alleviate and treat the whole of the person. And so one of the things that to be aware of is that there's so little protections for our genetic resources, our plants, our medicines. There's so little protection for our knowledge holders that it's not quite safe for us to just put out into the world what these medicines and what these practices are. Because the treatment of people in our traditional ways is not just, it's not prescriptive the way that it is in Western medicine, like go take 2 tablespoons of this. It's about treating the whole body. And I think that that's what's made our medicine men in particular so powerful and so important in our fight against COVID, because this has impacted not only our health, our physical health and the health of our communities, but the whole structure, the whole of the person, our mental, emotional, and our communal relationships. And so they've been approaching treatment in that way. And I think that that has just shown to me how powerful and how wonderfully invaluable our medicine and traditional knowledge holders are.
Thank you both. It's really an important reminder in this time that this isn't just about symptomatic treatment, right? This is a time to treat the whole self, and in all variety of ways, not just in a medicinal sense, but in a spiritual sense, in a psychological sense, and hopefully that's part of what tonight's discussion has helped shine a light on for so many of us. I'll open the floor if there are any other questions before we begin to close for the night. I'll just give it another moment or two. While we're doing that, I do see one quick question in the chat about, is there a website for updates? Tribal Link's website is a great place to go for that. We'll drop that into the chat so that people have the link. But if there are ways that you feel compelled to support, either through time, through resources, through donations, all of this work is really about getting those resources into the hands of these community leaders like the folks we have here tonight.
Michael, could I just make one comment? From hearing Janene and Jupta talk, it really made me start to think around, during the pandemic, when communities were shut down, countries were shut down, we actually started to see the resurgence, of fish life, animal life, because we had known, climate change, has been there all along, but it actually allowed our lands to start to heal, and, that goes in part with not just our physical, our spiritual, but also our environmental, which all plays a part in our well-being. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Karl. Appreciate that. So we're now going to begin to close this session out. But before we do, I'd like everyone to please just acknowledge and give thanks to these 3 amazing participants. They're all doing such great work in their communities. So whether you want to clap on your screen or use the emojis or whatever it might be, just give them a little love, because we really appreciate them spending their time and sharing their knowledge and wisdom with us.
Hey.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. If we think about the way to sort of close this, I think one of the things that I want to also pay attention to just very briefly is to thank Pamela Kraft and the Tribal Link organization. They have been such a foundational part of committing to these communities for over 2 decades, and really sort of showing that the work has to happen on the ground. And so Tribal Link has been an amazing organization, as has the partnership they've built with the Equator Initiative. And so thank you to those folks as well for all of the work that you've done to help make things like this evening possible. I'd also like to thank our interpreters, who have done a great job. I haven't heard them, but I'm assuming they've done a great job because you know, all of us here are joining with a variety of different languages, and it's important that we make this a global community where we're sharing this information in ways that can be understood as much as possible. I hope today's sessions, both the morning and the evening, and they will be available online if anyone had missed one or the other or would like to go back and take another look or share it in your communities. I hope they've inspired you to continue to support the efforts of organizations like Tribal Link and Equator Initiative. As this world continues to face new challenges, it's efforts like them and leaders like the ones we heard from today who have to continue to be supported and amplified. So thank you. Please take care of yourself. And until next time, we wish you well.
And I wanted to just add in, this is Pamela Kraft from Tribal Link. What a privilege it's been to spend time with Indigenous peoples, giving us the opportunity to be part of their world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, everybody. Until we meet again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Oi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Great to see you guys.
Hi, guys. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. Hi, Hog.
Hi.
Hi.
Right, bye.
Thank you to the interpreters. Excellent work. Thank you.